Now, I still haven't actually said what Darwin's ideas were, just that he had made some observations. Remember that at this time, scientists have already established that organisms have changed throughout time. What they haven't established is what is the mechanism that causes that change. So, what is the driving factor for evolution? And that's what Darwin gives us. He gives us a way to understand not just that organisms are changing, but how they're changing and based on what set of circumstances. Up until this point, we've been talking about the theory of evolution, but it's important to note at this point that Darwin isn't responsible for the whole theory of evolution. He's primarily responsible for one part of the theory of evolution, which is the theory of natural selection. And that's the method that describes how organisms and populations change over time. So, in its most basic form, Darwin's theory of natural selection is this. Within a population of organisms, there are variations. So, for example, you have a white deer and you have a brown deer. Now, depending on the environmental conditions that exist, it might be better for a deer to be brown, or it might be better for a deer to be white. Now, those environmental conditions can change. So, if in the beginning of time conditions favor the white deer, later they could just as easily end up favoring the brown deer. But what Darwin says is that depending on the environmental conditions that exist within that population, some organisms will have adaptations such as brown fur or white fur that will give them a survival advantage. What that means is that if a brown deer has better camouflage in, let's say, a forest, then it will have a higher chance of surviving. Whereas white deers aren't so well camouflaged with white fur in a forest, they will have a lower chance of survival. Now, I hope that you're thinking, well, we could just as easily put them in, let's say, a mountaintop or in the tundra. And if we do that, then now all of a sudden the white fur becomes a more valuable adaptation under those specific set of circumstances. But let's say, for example, we're in the forest and your brown deer has an adaptation that helps it survive. It will be more likely to reach reproductive age. And if it reaches reproductive age, it will have a higher chance of having children than will the white deer. So whoever lives to reproductive age, or whoever has the better chance of reaching reproductive age, has a better chance of having offspring. Now, not only do they have a better chance of having at least one offspring, but the more years that an organism survives while it's fertile, the more offspring it could potentially have. So that means that if, let's say, a brown deer has a 70% higher chance of surviving, not only will it have a better chance of surviving to that age, but it will have a better chance of having mates. It will have a better chance of being able to provide food for its children, and therefore have children that also reach reproductive maturity. And so, in a nutshell, this is the idea of natural selection, that there's variation and that the environment, depending on its conditions, will have selective influence on the adaptations that are most favorable. Now, there's a series of logic that is a little bit more complicated in terms of how did Charles Darwin actually come up with this theory. And so the first point of logic is that for any species, for humans, for dogs, for cats, there would be an exponential increase in population size if every individual had children and every individual had the same amount of children. You could imagine that 2 mice over the period of 50 years would be able to generate millions or billions of mice if given the opportunity. But we know that not every single species on Earth has billions or trillions of individuals that make up its population. And so the conclusion that we get is that there must be something limiting the population size. And in fact, if we look at populations throughout the environment, with the exception of humans at this current stage, we usually find that populations have a very stable number of individuals. So, for example, if I look at the caribou population 50 years ago and I look at it today, unless there's been a change in hunting practices or some epidemic, I would tend to find the same number of caribou from one time to the other. So even though there's this potential for organisms to reproduce constantly in an exponential sort of way, we find that populations are limited in size, that they don't reach exponential proportions, and that, you know, our Earth isn't covered 6 meters deep in rats. And so the reason why we don't find unlimited numbers of organisms on Earth is because there's some limiting factor, and that limiting factor could be any number of resources, whether it be food, water, shelter, or it could be something more complicated. If you take a look at human populations, when we started to urbanize and continuing to this day, we are at greater risk of certain types of diseases, be they bacteria or be they viruses. And so population density creates whole new limiting factors which can reduce the overall size of a population. Whatever the case may be, there isn't unlimited resources for a species. And so because of that, species are forced to compete against each other, and individuals within the species will also compete against each other. So for example, if we look at mice are going to be competing after the same resources within their own population. They compete for the same types of food, they compete for the same type of mates, they compete for the same location, for the same space. And so what this means is that not everyone can survive, and now what we have to look at is what are the adaptations that favor some organisms' survival over others.